The morning the lien notice arrived, the light over our kitchen sink felt too bright, the kind of harsh white that exposes every speck on the counter and every crack in the paint. I stood there in my socks, holding an oversized envelope from the association with my name in blocky black letters that looked more like a warning than mail. Somewhere in the background, the refrigerator hummed and the sprinklers outside hissed to life in the neighbor's yard. Inside was a packet, stapled at the top, stamped with a bold heading about an emergency board hearing set for Friday. Buried in the dense paragraphs was the phrase that made my stomach twist: proposed lien in the amount of $5,000 for ongoing covenant violations. According to this, the violations were all tied to one thing: our backyard fence. That beige, weathered stretch of wood I barely thought about most days had apparently become the main character in a homeowners association drama I never asked to star in. The notice explained that if the board approved the lien on Friday, they could start collection efforts, add legal fees, and, in the extreme, enforce it against our property title. Reading between the lines, the message was clear: fix the fence their way or risk everything we had built here. The supposed violations went back months, with dates I half recognized from earlier envelopes I had opened with a sinking feeling and then quietly stacked on the corner of my desk. The board claimed we had failed to comply with the newly adopted fence height standard and had ignored prior requests to lower our fence line along the rear of the lot. According to them, the fines had matured, and time had run out. I pressed my fingers against the paper where they mentioned that Friday hearing, imagining the board sitting around a folding table with bottled water and printed agendas, voting on whether to hang a financial noose over our home. The idea that a handful of neighbors could sign their names and suddenly we would be facing a $5,000 lien felt unreal, like a nightmare that made perfect sense only while you were still half asleep. But under the fear, another feeling flickered: a sharp, stubborn anger. This was not how the community was sold to us when we moved in. This was not what the rules looked like when our fence was first approved. And I was starting to suspect that somewhere, in some dusty file or forgotten record, there was proof that the board was pushing their power much farther than they had any right to. I did not know it yet, but that proof would trace back to a document recorded on May 12, 2010, a quiet little easement entry that most people would have skimmed past. I also had no idea that an overlooked zoning attorney, someone not even on the association's usual radar, would be the one to pull that thread. At that moment, though, all I could see was the countdown to Friday's hearing and the ugly, oversized number next to the word lien. The board wanted our fence lowered, our backyard exposed, and our compliance signed and dated. The question hanging over everything was simple and brutal: could we stop this $5,000 lien before the board got their vote? I flattened the notice on the counter, listened to the faint thud of a delivery truck turning at the end of our Cul De Sac, and realized this was no longer just about a fence. It was about whether the people who lived on Maple Court still had any say in where their boundaries ended and the association's control began. To understand how that fence became a battleground, you have to know what Maple Court looked like before the measuring tape and violation letters took over. Maple Court is a short cul-de-sac, a little loop off a larger neighborhood road, lined with tidy two-story homes that all look distantly related. In the evening, porch lights glow soft yellow, and on mild nights you can hear the muted rhythm of kids bouncing basketballs near the circle at the end of the street. When we first moved in, it was the kind of place where people waved when they drove past, even if they did not know your name yet. Our house sits near the bend of the cul-de-sac, with a backyard that backs up to a narrow strip of common area. Beyond that, there is a drainage swale and a slender walking path that leads to a small retention pond. That is why the original fences along our row were built taller than you might see in other neighborhoods. 6-foot privacy fences made sense when joggers and dog walkers moved along behind your property line. When we closed on the house, the title company handed us a thick folder, and tucked in there was a plat map with faint lines tracing the back of our lot. Along that rear edge, there was a thin rectangle labeled Drainage and Access Easement, with a note referencing a document recorded on May 12, 2010. At the time, it was just another line on a map we barely understood. We cared more about where to put the grill. The association, on paper, was simple. There was a board of 5, the president, a vice president, a treasurer, a secretary, and one at-large member. The president, a woman I will call Mrs. H., had lived on the street since the early days of the development. Her house, a corner lot property near the entrance, had a perfect, magazine-ready lawn and a front porch lined with seasonal decorations that rotated like clockwork. But once you lived here a little while, you learned that her favorite accessory was not the wreath on her door, it was the clipboard in her hand. She had a habit of taking early evening walks with a printed map of the community and a pencil tucked behind her ear. If a trash can spent too much time at the curb or a basketball hoop didn't get rolled back to the side yard fast enough, it found its way onto her notes. At first, it felt like a quirky personality trait. Then she became president. When she took over, the board started talking about harmonizing the look of the neighborhood. A few months before the fence drama really started, we all got a glossy letter in the mail about a fence standards addendum, dated March 1st and labeled in the corner as CCR Section 4.3. The association called it a design refresh. Buried in the legal style paragraphs was the new rule: all rear and side fences were supposed to be 4 feet tall, constructed in certain approved styles. The problem was that a big chunk of Maple Court did not match that, and never had. Most of us had 6-foot fences along the back, built that way when the lots were first developed. In our own welcome packet, there was a photocopied architectural review approval page for the original build that allowed that height specifically because of the common area and path behind us. The board knew this, the documentation was literally in the association's own files. Still, the addendum did not mention this exception. Instead, it declared that all future and existing fences needed to be brought into compliance to preserve visual cohesion and open sight lines within the community. The letter framed it like a simple cosmetic update, as if asking residents to swap out a porch light instead of chopping down the walls of their privacy. If you ever wanted a living example of Karen neighbor drama, you could have pointed a camera at Maple Court in the weeks after that letter. Neighbors whispered at mailboxes and swapped photos of the addendum page like it was a confidential file. Someone highlighted the section about open sight lines and passed it around as a joke, saying it was code for "the board wants to see into your backyard." The more I read, the more uneasy I felt. I could live with replacing a fence when it wore out naturally. But dropping our fence down 2 full feet, exposing our back windows, our patio furniture, and our weekend mess to the walking path behind us, felt like a forced surrender of the little privacy we had. It rubbed against everything I believed about having a home, that once you closed your gate, the space inside was yours. The first clue that the board's harmonizing was not just a suggestion came a few weeks later, when I looked out the front window and saw Mrs. H walking down the sidewalk with a tape measure. She would stop at each property corner, tug the metal tape out, scribble down a number, then move on. Sometimes she craned her neck, trying to see over side gates into backyards. It was not long before the violation notices started to appear. One afternoon, when the sun was sliding behind the roofs and the shadows of our fences stretched long across the grass, I came home to find a bright slip of paper taped to our front door. Even the birds seemed quiet along the fence line that day, like the whole street was holding its breath. The notice was labeled courtesy reminder, but there was nothing gentle about it. According to the document, our rear fence was in material noncompliance with CCR Section 4.3 and the Fence Standards Addendum. It listed the current measured height as approximately 6 feet and ordered that it be reduced to 4 feet within 30 days. It warned that failure to comply could result in fines, suspension of privileges, and, eventually, legal remedies. I read the notice twice, then a third time, tracing the letters with my eyes as if repetition might change their meaning. It named our lot number, our address, and even attached a small printed photo of our fence taken from the common area behind the house. The date at the top matched the morning I had seen the tape measure moving up the street. What stung more than the dry legal language was the assumption baked into it, that we were in violation, that we had built something improper, that we were the ones trying to skirt the rules. There was no mention of the original approvals, no acknowledgement that the very fence they were attacking had been part of the neighborhood's design from the start. I set the notice down and unfolded the dusty welcome packet from the file cabinet in our hallway. The binder smelled faintly like paper and old toner. Tucked between the glossy sales brochure and the covenants was a thin, stapled page titled Architectural Review Approval. It was dated August 3rd, a few years back, and it listed 6-foot cedar privacy fence along rear lot line as approved for our property. The approval was signed by a previous board chair, with a neat, looping signature. I held the new violation notice in one hand and the old approval in the other. Same property, same fence, two very different stories about what was allowed. This was the first evidence prop in what would become a long, exhausting fight, a piece of paper that quietly contradicted everything the current president was claiming about our supposedly non-compliant fence. At that point, I did not yet think of it as evidence. It was just proof that I was not losing my mind. The next few days on Maple Court were a strange mix of normal routine and simmering tension. Delivery vans came and went, kids rode scooters and loops on the Cul De Sac, and I could still hear the soft clink of dishes through open kitchen windows. But everywhere I looked, there were new slips of paper taped to doors, new notices peeking out of mailboxes. I started comparing stories with the neighbors I was closest to. One had received the same courtesy reminder about their rear fence. Another, whose yard backed up to a different stretch of common area, had an advisory notice suggesting they preemptively planned for a future fence modification. The language was different, but the message felt the same. The board expected us to fall in line with the 4-foot standard, no matter what had been allowed before. In the evenings, as I sat on our patio, the fence that had always felt like a protective backdrop suddenly felt like a countdown timer. I kept thinking about how it would feel to sit there with the boards chopped down, the walking path behind us wide open, each passerby able to see our dinner plates, our laundry basket, our kids' toys. The closer we got to that 30-day deadline, the more obvious it became that this fight was never really about lumber and measurements. It was about whether the board could redraw the line between public and private, between their authority and our boundaries, and expect us to nod along while they did it. I knew we had two choices: quietly comply, paying for the privilege of feeling exposed in our own backyard, or push back against a board that clearly believed its new rules outweighed its old promises. Neither option felt easy. One threatened our privacy, the other risked fines, hearings, and who knew what else. Sitting at the dining table that night, I spread out the documents in front of me. On one side, the courtesy reminder with its stern references to CCR Section 4.3 and the Fence Standards Addendum. On the other, the older architectural review approval with its calm, matter-of-fact permission for a 6-foot rear fence. Off to the corner, I laid the plat map from our closing documents, that faint rectangle along the rear labeled drainage and access easement, referencing some record from May 12, 2010. At the time, I could not see how that easement would come back into the story. It was just another technical term in a sea of them. Still, I traced the line with my finger and wondered why the original builder had wanted that recorded so specifically. For now, my focus was simple: I needed a way to answer the board that did not sound emotional or desperate. I opened my laptop and started drafting a letter, referencing the approval page, quoting the section of the covenants that grandfathered in previously authorized improvements, and politely asking the board to rescind the notice. I made sure to mention that the fence had not changed height since the approval date, that it had been inspected at the time of construction, and that the association had accepted our dues and sent years of routine mail without ever raising an issue. I even attached a scanned copy of the approval page as an exhibit, labeling it as if I were prepping for a small, private trial. When I finished, the room was quiet except for the low whir of the ceiling fan. The sky outside had gone from blue to deep purple, and the porch light cast a soft glow against the fence boards. I felt a little surge of relief, the kind you get when you think you have found the reasonable, grown-up way to solve a problem. I clicked send on the email to the board's generic address, attached the documents, and sat back in my chair. In my mind, the next steps were straightforward: someone on the board would review the paperwork, realize the oversight, and back off. Maybe they would even adjust the new standards to carve out an exception for our stretch of rear lots. What I did not realize was that to people who treated control like a sport, a calm, documented challenge was not a reason to reconsider. It was a reason to dig in. The courtesy period on that notice was still ticking down. The tape measure had already done its rounds. And while I was hoping for reason, the board was busy preparing a different kind of response, one that would shift the fence dispute from annoying to threatening. The fence at the back of our yard was no longer just wood and nails, it was a line in the sand the association fully intended to cross. A week passed after I sent that email to the board, and the silence stretched out longer than I expected. Each time my phone buzzed or my inbox pinged, I half hoped it would be a sane message from someone willing to admit the association got this one wrong. Instead, the only messages that came through were promotions and receipts. Outside, the late afternoon sun turned the fence line into a row of dark silhouettes, and the air felt heavier than usual for our quiet little cul-de-sac. On the 8th day, the board finally responded. It was not a personal reply from anyone I knew. It came from the community's generic management email address, formatted like a form letter, starting with a stiff greeting and sliding straight into policy language. According to the note, the board had reviewed the concern and supporting documentation I submitted, including the old approval. Then it delivered the conclusion in a single chilly paragraph. The new fence standards addendum applied to all existing rear fences, regardless of prior approvals, because the board had the authority to update and clarify design expectations. They did not use my name. They did not acknowledge that the original approval came from their own predecessors. They did not reference the easement or the specific conditions behind our fence line. They simply stated that the notice stood as issued, that the 30-day deadline remained in place, and that failure to comply could result in fines and further enforcement. At the bottom of the message was a short line reminding me that I had the right to request a hearing before the board. It sounded generous at first glance, until I realized what it meant. If I disagreed, I could stand in front of the same people who had already decided I was wrong and try to convince them otherwise. That was the moment when the conflict stopped being a misunderstanding in my head and turned into an official standoff. The board had drawn a clear line. They were not confused. They were not unaware of the old documents. They simply believed their new standard overruled all of it. I printed the email and added it to my growing stack of papers: the courtesy notice, the approval page, the plat map with its thin, cryptic easement line. The pile looked less like neighborly correspondence and more like a case file. As the days ticked by, the atmosphere on Maple Court shifted. I started noticing which fences had been cut down and which still stood tall. One neighbor, 2 houses down, had already lowered their rear fence. Suddenly, their patio furniture and back door were exposed to the walking path. Their yard looked brighter and more open, but it also looked vulnerable. In the evenings, when the porch lights flicked on and the air cooled, I could hear faint laughter and clinking glasses drifting out from those newly exposed patios. It was normal neighbor sound, but it no longer felt private. Our taller fence, still intact for the moment, now stood out like a holdout in a lineup. The board's power moved quietly through these small changes. Every lowered fence was a subtle billboard reminding the rest of us what compliance looked like. The second notice came with a new tone and a new heading. One afternoon, I found another envelope on the doormat, this one marked in heavier print: violation notice and fine assessment. The paper inside felt thicker, the kind of stock that wanted to be taken seriously. According to this updated notice, our non-compliant rear fence had moved from courtesy reminder to active violation. Attached to the notice was a one-page fine ledger summary dated April 30th. It listed line items in neat, unforgiving rows: initial violation fine, non-compliance daily fine, administrative processing fee. Each line had a dollar amount next to it, building to a total that was far from symbolic. The ledger referenced a new resolution I had never heard of: Fine Schedule Resolution 23-02. Apparently, the board had voted on and adopted the schedule at a meeting earlier in the year, and now it was the backbone for every penalty they wanted to impose. At the bottom of the ledger was a chilling sentence explaining that unpaid fines could be converted into a lien against the property, with additional legal and collection costs added. I felt a tightness in my chest as I read the numbers. This was no longer hypothetical. They were actively billing us for choosing to keep our fence at the height they themselves had approved years ago. There was something surreal about seeing my backyard reduced to rows on a ledger. A structure that kept my family's daily life out of public view was now being treated like a debt-producing asset for the board. Outside, the cul-de-sac sounded deceptively peaceful. A lawn mower droned softly down the street, and somewhere a dog barked twice and then settled. But on paper, the association had escalated. Our household was now on a list somewhere, marked as a non-compliant property generating revenue. I read the notice again, this time paying closer attention to the wording at the end. It gave a date, 2 weeks from now, by which the fence had to be brought into compliance to stop the mounting daily fines. It also stated that if the violation remained unresolved after that date, the matter could be scheduled for an enforcement hearing to consider further action, including the filing of a lien. The phrase, filing of a lien, sat on the page like a threat and a promise. The next few days, I saw more signs that this was not just happening to us. Several houses along the back row had similar envelopes taped to their doors. One neighbor mentioned, in a quiet conversation near their mailbox, that they had already paid their initial fines and scheduled a contractor to rebuild their fence. They did not like it, but they called it the cost of living here now. As more fences came down, the walking path behind our house grew brighter in the afternoon light, the sun spilling into spaces that used to be shaded by tall boards. The sound of footsteps on the path carried more clearly into our yard. We started moving differently when we were outside, instinctively staying closer to the house, aware of how easily we could be seen. The board had found a way to turn a design preference into a financial pressure point. Little by little, they were reshaping the entire rear line of Maple Court to match their vision, one fine at a time. The worst part was simple: every day we waited, those fines grew, and the ledger's total climbed closer to a number that could not be brushed off as an annoyance. This was not just an HOA nightmare about paint colors or holiday lights. It was thousands of dollars at stake, hanging over our heads like a storm cloud that could soak into our credit, our mortgage, and our future plans if we let it. I started to realize that the board's ultimate power was not in their ability to send sternly worded letters. It was in their ability to translate disobedience into dollars and, if necessary, freeze that into the very title of our home. The official turning point came in an envelope labeled Final Violation Notice and Hearing Notice. By then, I already expected the worst whenever I saw the association's logo. Still, my hands shook a little as I opened this one at the kitchen table. Outside, the sky had turned a soft gray, and distant thunder rumbled behind the rooftops, giving the whole scene an unwanted layer of drama. The notice contained two main parts. The first repeated the accusation: our rear fence was in continuing violation of CCR Section 4.3 in the Fence Standards Addendum. It stated that earlier notices and fines had been ignored, never mind the fact that I had responded with documentation and questions. The second part laid out what came next. The board had scheduled an emergency enforcement hearing for Friday at 7 p.m., in the community meeting room near the pool. The agenda, according to a short board agenda excerpt attached to the notice, included a specific line that made my blood run cold. Item 3, consideration of lien authorization for continued fence noncompliance, Lot 17, Maple Court. They were not just thinking about a lien in the abstract. They were planning to talk about authorizing one against our specific lot. The notice explained that I had the right to attend and present relevant information, but it did not promise anything more than that. The board would hear, deliberate, and vote. The same people who had adopted the new fence standard, sent the notices, and rejected my earlier explanation would now decide whether to lodge a $5,000 lien against our home. Reading that line about the lien amount, I remembered the fine ledger summary and how quickly the numbers had climbed. With the additional administrative fees, projected daily fines, and the enforcement costs, the total they were aiming to convert into a lien sat just under $5,000. It was a number big enough to show up on a title search, big enough to matter if we ever needed to refinance, sell, or tap our equity. I set the notice down and stared at the board agenda excerpt. It was only a few lines, but the impact behind them was immense. That little bullet point was the board's way of saying, we are willing to carry this fight all the way into your property records. The hearing was only days away. The board had a clear path. We had scattered pieces of proof and a growing sense of unfairness. Somewhere in the middle, there had to be a way to push back effectively, not just emotionally, but structurally. The easement on our plat map still nagged at the back of my mind. That thin strip behind our fence, recorded on May 12, 2010, could not be meaningless. It existed for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it had shaped the way our rear boundary was supposed to function. The original approval for a 6-foot fence had not come out of nowhere. The problem was that I was not a lawyer, not a planner, and not someone who instinctively knew how all these documents fit together. I had the pieces, but I could not see the whole picture yet. I did know one thing: walking into that hearing unprepared, with nothing but my sense of what was fair, would be like stepping into a storm without an umbrella. The board was preparing to turn a design dispute into a binding financial mark against our home by Friday night. If we could not find a way to challenge the foundation of their authority before then, this would not just be a story about a fence. It would be a story about how a handful of neighbors with power could redraw someone's financial future with a vote and a signature. In that uncomfortable space between fear and anger, I realized we needed help from someone the board had not already intimidated. By the week of the hearing, our quiet maple court had become the front line of a battle over one stretch of wood and the authority behind it. The board had ignored the old approval, escalated from courtesy reminders to a formal fine ledger, and now aimed a $5,000 lien squarely at our lot number. Finding the right person to help did not happen in a dramatic flash. It happened on a humid afternoon when the air over the Cul De Sac felt thick and still, the kind of day when sound carries just a little farther than usual. I was out front, stacking the trash bins back beside the garage, when a neighbor from the far end of the street slowed her walk and stopped near our driveway. She had always been quiet in meetings, the type who listened more than she spoke. That afternoon, she glanced toward our house, then toward the line of fences behind us, and made a simple observation about the notices everyone had been getting. Without repeating her exact words, the message was clear: she thought the board was pushing too far, and she thought we had a point about the original approvals. Then she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that her cousin had once dealt with a boundary problem in a different community and had used a zoning attorney instead of a general practice lawyer. A zoning attorney. The term sounded oddly specific, almost niche. That night, as the crickets started to chirp outside and the streetlights cast dull halos over the parked cars in the cul-de-sac, I sat at my laptop and started searching. I filtered past the big firms with polished stock photos and focused on the smaller listings. That was how I found him. His office was not downtown in a shiny building, it was in a converted house on a side street near the county offices. His website was simple, almost plain, with none of the flashy slogans the larger firms used. But his practice areas were exactly what caught my eye: land use, zoning, easements, and covenant disputes. The kind of details most people only thought about once something went wrong. In a community where the same few names floated around every association issue, his name had never come up. That alone made him interesting. He was not on the board's short list of familiar professionals. He was someone they might not see coming. The next morning, with the hearing only a few days away, I called his office and explained the basics: a new fence standard, an old approval for a 6-foot rear fence, escalating fines, and a looming lien. I mentioned the easement on the plat map and the cryptic reference to a document recorded on May 12, 2010. He did not rush me. He did not offer instant guarantees. He simply said he needed to see everything: the covenants, the addendum, the approval, the notices, the fine ledger, and any recorded documents tied to our lot. In the middle of gathering it all, I realized how much paper this petty fight had already produced. The fine ledger summary, the board agenda excerpt, the CCR Section 4.3 addendum, the original architectural review approval, and the plat map together formed a small archive. Up until now, they had felt like separate frustrations. Under his direction, they started to look like interconnected evidence. As I scanned the documents to send, one thought kept pulsing in the back of my mind: if this quiet zoning attorney could find even one fracture in the board's authority before Friday, he might not just save us from a $5,000 lien. He might force the association to explain, on the record, why their power over our boundary was not as absolute as they wanted everyone to believe, and that public unraveling was exactly the kind of social shame the president feared most. The retaliation phase had not fully begun yet, but the pieces were moving into place. We were no longer just reacting to the board's notices. We were preparing to challenge the foundation beneath them. The zoning attorney called back the next afternoon while the sky over Maple Court was a pale, washed-out blue and the air shimmered slightly above the asphalt. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the shadows of our tall fence stretch across the grass, when his calm voice began lining up pieces I had been staring at without understanding. He had pulled the recorded easement from the county records, the one tied to that faint rectangle on our plat map. It was more than a casual note. It was a formal drainage and access easement, recorded on May 12, 2010, with language that did something important. It recognized that the lots along our rear line backed onto a functional buffer and called for a barrier that respected privacy and safety along that boundary. In plain terms, the original development pattern had assumed a taller, solid separation between the backyards and the easement corridor. That was why the builder pursued 6-foot privacy fences along our row. The architectural approvals, including ours, flowed from that baseline. The association had inherited those conditions, it had not invented them. The attorney pointed out another key detail in the covenants I had glossed over. There was a section stating that any rules, addenda, or design standards adopted by the board had to be consistent with recorded plats, easements, and applicable municipal codes. If a board rule conflicted with those higher-level documents, the rule gave way. In his view, the fence standards addendum had one glaring problem. It tried to pull our rear fences down to 4 feet across the board without acknowledging that some of those fences sat along a recorded easement corridor that had been planned with taller barriers in mind. The board might have the power to tweak paint colors and landscaping guidelines, but it did not have the power to rewrite the physical logic of a recorded easement. He asked about our local codes, and I sent over a link to the city's online zoning map and fence height guidelines. Later that day, he forwarded a short note he had received from a city staffer. It was not a formal opinion, just a clarification. Along certain drainage or access easements, privacy fences at 6 feet were common and often expected as part of the original subdivision design. That note, the easement document, the original approval, and the covenants all pointed in the same direction. The board's new 4-foot rule might work in some parts of the community, but it could not be enforced blindly where the underlying property documents assumed something different. The attorney pulled these threads together into something I had not been able to construct on my own, a coherent narrative that did not just say the situation felt unfair, but explained why the board's enforcement might overstep the authority it actually had. That afternoon, with the ceiling fan whirring above me and a stack of printed pages spread across the table, I watched him turn our frustration into structure. He drafted a letter addressed to the board and the community manager, using a measured, steady tone that contrasted sharply with the sharp edges of the notices we had received. The letter walked through everything: the recorded easement from May 12, 2010, the original 6-foot fence approvals, the covenants clause tying board rules to higher-level documents, and the fine schedule resolution 23-02 that had turned design preferences into escalating penalties. It concluded with a simple position: any attempt to impose a lien based on enforcing the 4-foot standard against our rear fence along that easement would be inconsistent with the governing documents and potentially unenforceable. He did not threaten. He did not posture. He simply laid out that if the board pushed ahead, they would be creating a dispute over the validity of their own actions, not just a disagreement about style. For the first time since the notices started, the balance of risk shifted. Until that moment, all the consequences had seemed to sit on our side of the fence: fines, liens, and the stress of defying the board. Now there was a quiet but serious consequence staring back at the association. If they insisted on the lien despite the easement and their own covenants, they would not just be punishing a homeowner. They would be walking themselves into a possible legal challenge over the scope of their power. We decided that the attorney would attend the emergency hearing with us. He did not promise a dramatic confrontation. Instead, he described something more controlled: a methodical presentation of the documents, on the record, with clear questions the board would have to answer in front of their own neighbors. The hearing was still set for Friday. The agenda still listed our lot and that ominous lien item. But the story had shifted. The board would not be the only ones reading from prepared pages under the bright lights of the meeting room. Friday evening arrived with heavy air and a faint smell of cut grass hanging over Maple Court. As the sun dropped behind the roofs, porch lights blinked on one by one, and a slow trickle of cars made its way toward the community building near the pool. Inside, the meeting room lights buzzed softly, casting a flat, almost clinical glow over folding chairs and a long table at the front. When we walked in, the board members were already seated. The president sat in the middle with her familiar stack of papers and a neat clipboard. The treasurer and secretary flanked her, along with the vice president and the at-large member, all lined up like a panel in a small-scale hearing. A few residents had gathered in the rows of chairs. Some were there for other agenda items, but enough had heard about the fence issues to know something was brewing. I carried a plain folder. The attorney carried a slightly thicker one, organized in a way that instantly calmed me: tabs, highlights, and quietly marked sections. Somewhere among those pages were the easement, the covenants, and the city's fence clarification, lined up like a series of stepping stones. The meeting started with ordinary business, the kind that usually fills these evenings: approval of minutes, a financial summary, a brief report about landscaping. The sound of shuffling papers and the low hum of the air conditioning made it feel routine, almost sleepy. Then the president reached the enforcement section of the agenda and announced the item involving rear fence compliance on Maple Court. Eyes in the room shifted toward us, then back to the board. The board agenda excerpt we had received came to life as she acknowledged that the next item involved possible lien authorization for our lot. The attorney stayed calm. When the president invited us to address the board, I spoke first, explaining in straightforward terms that we believed our fence had been properly approved and that the board's new standard conflicted with both that prior approval and the conditions along our easement corridor. Then I stepped back, letting him take over with a quiet confidence that contrasted with the tension in the room. He did something simple but devastating for the board's narrative. He followed the paper trail out loud. He referenced the drainage and access easement recorded on May 12, 2010, noting that it covered the strip of land behind our lot and others along the rear of Maple Court. He explained that the original fence approvals, including ours, reflected that this corridor would be separated from the backyards by a taller privacy barrier. Then he pointed to the covenants clause requiring that any board standards remain consistent with recorded documents. He did not accuse. He asked. He asked how the fence standards addendum had accounted for the easement corridor behind our row. He asked whether the board had sought legal advice on how its 4-foot rule would interact with prior approvals tied to that corridor. He asked whether the fine schedule resolution 23-02 had been drafted with any exception for lots backed by recorded buffers like ours. Each question drew the board's focus back to their own paperwork. The president flipped through her binder. The treasurer adjusted his glasses, scanning a copy of the addendum. The community manager, sitting off to the side, checked a folder of printed documents. The attorney then briefly summarized the city's informal clarification that 6-foot fences along certain easements were consistent with the subdivision's original design. He did not overstate it. He used it to support a modest but powerful point: the board might be attempting to enforce a standard that did not fit the way this part of the neighborhood had been built to function. He ended with a steady conclusion. He said he believed that any attempt to record a lien against our property based on enforcing the 4-foot fence rule along this easement would raise serious questions about the validity of that enforcement, given the conflicting documents and the board's own governing language. He requested that the board withdraw the lien item and review the standard as it applied to our specific corridor. For a moment, the room felt very still. The board had come prepared to talk about our non-compliance and our mounting fines. Now they were being asked, in front of their neighbors, to justify the legality of their own actions. If they pushed ahead with the lien regardless of the easement and the covenants, they would be stepping into territory where their decisions could be challenged as inconsistent and possibly overturned. The consequences would not just land on our side of the fence, they would land on theirs. The president asked for a brief recess. The board members leaned close together at the front table, voices low but faces tight. Neighbors in the chairs traded small, careful looks. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, giving the whole scene a faint, unreal glow, like a scene from a small-town hearing in a long-running HOA revenge story. After several minutes, the board called the meeting back to order. The president's expression was composed, but there was a stiffness around her eyes that had not been there at the start of the evening. She stated that after considering the information presented, the board would not be moving forward with lien authorization for our lot that night. Instead, she said, they would be directing their counsel to review how the fence standards applied to lots along the rear easement corridor on Maple Court and would suspend further fines for those lots while that review took place. She also mentioned that any existing fines tied solely to rear fence height along that corridor would be held and potentially reversed, pending that review. She made it sound procedural, as if the board had been planning to conduct this kind of thoughtful analysis all along. But in that room, everyone understood what had just happened. A homeowner the board had expected to pressure into quiet compliance had arrived with a clear, documented challenge and a zoning attorney who knew how to speak the language of easements and covenants. The board had looked into the mirror of its own documents and stepped back from the edge. It was not a shouted victory. It was a measured retreat that carried a different kind of satisfaction. The lien had been stopped before it began. The thread hanging over our title had been pulled back into the board's own file folders. The aftermath unfolded more slowly, like the way evening settles over Maple Court when the streetlights begin to glow and the cicadas start their steady rhythm. Within a few weeks, we received a new letter from the association. It was not labeled as a violation. Instead, it was framed as a clarification. The board explained that, after consulting with council, it had decided to recognize an exception to the 4-foot fence standard for rear lot lines that backed onto certain easement corridors, consistent with original approvals and recorded documents. The letter referenced the easement recorded on May 12, 2010, using the formal instrument number in the county records. It noted that lots along that corridor, including ours, would be treated as compliant at their existing 6-foot rear fence height, provided the fences were maintained in good condition. There was also a separate notice regarding fines. It explained that fines related solely to rear fence height for those lots had been reversed, and future enforcement efforts along that corridor would focus on maintenance rather than height. In practical terms, the numbers on our fine ledger summary were wiped away, replaced by a zero balance that felt more like justice than a gift. On Maple Court, the impact was easy to see. The fences along the rear of our row stayed tall. Neighbors who had been quietly debating whether to give in and cut their fences down stopped calling contractors. Conversations at mailboxes shifted from anxious speculation to relieved storytelling. People who had once shrugged and said that this was just the cost of living in a strict community started to talk about boundaries in a new way. The board, for its part, did not stage a public apology. That was never their style. But change showed up in smaller, subtler ways. At the next annual meeting, the president's report on enforcement was shorter and less sharp. There were fewer references to cracking down and more references to aligning with the governing documents. Over time, leadership shifted. The president eventually stepped down, citing a desire to focus on other commitments. A new mix of board members took her place, including one neighbor from Maple Court who had watched the hearing carefully from the back row. The new board still enforced rules, but they moved more cautiously when those rules brushed up against recorded easements or long-standing approvals. Our zoning attorney went back to his quiet office near the county buildings, but his name lingered on Maple Court in a different way. His work turned into a kind of cautionary tale, a reminder that the association's power was not limitless, and that a carefully documented challenge could reset the balance. For me, the biggest change was internal. The fence at the back of our yard no longer felt like a countdown timer or a liability. It felt like what it was meant to be from the start, a boundary that defined our space, created privacy from the path beyond, and stood within the framework of how the neighborhood had been designed. The association had tried to pull that boundary down, both literally and figuratively. It took an easement recorded years before we moved in and an overlooked zoning attorney to remind everyone where the lines really were. Looking back, the whole saga fits neatly into the pattern of a satisfying revenge story, even if no one raised their voice or stormed out of the room. The revenge was not dramatic sabotage, it was something quieter and more durable. It was watching a board that had leaned on authority learn, in public, that even it had to obey the documents it claimed to defend. In the end, the lien never touched our title. Our fence stayed standing. And Maple Court discovered that even in a place ruled by policies and addenda, homeowners still had the ability to push back when power strayed past its proper boundary. Tell me your worst fence or HOA lien horror in one line.